If we look at individual species, and this is the top 20 declining bird species during that same time period from the Maryland Breeding Bird Survey. And you can see northern bobwhite tops the list as the number one declining bird in Maryland. Many people don't know that. Doesn't get a lot of press. We're trying to get the word out. But if you look, this chart of the top 20 declining ones is colored by whether they are an early successional or a shrub preferring bird species. And so if they're in green, they like that early successional vegetation communities. And so you see 9 of the top 10 prefer this grassland or early successional habitat. So this is kind of a wake-up call that I'm trying to get the word out that we need to work on our grasslands and our shrublands. Hello, and welcome to our March session of the Land and Wildlife Speaker Series. I'm excited to be speaking with all of you guys today. All right, welcome. Well, I thought this would be a great opportunity to give an update on some of the happenings with bobwhite quail in the state. I was invited to speak for the Quail Forever banquet a couple of weeks ago, and also to the University of Maryland Department of Environmental Science and Technology. And so each time I gave a version of this talk, and I thought this would be a good time to update everybody else who wasn't able to go to those events on what I think about is the current state of bobwhite recovery, especially in Maryland, and talk about generally about habitat. We hear a lot about it, but we're going to get in just a different angle on it. So let's dive right in. We're also going to talk a bit about the monitoring work we've been doing over the years. We've got a lot going on with acoustic monitoring, and it is finally coming to fruition, and it's really exciting. So I want to share some screenshots of our platform for that. So let's dive in. So our outline here, I like to give everybody an outline of where we're going, and so you know how long it'll be till we're done. And start with some background on bobwhites, and we're going to talk about land cover and habitat. And I break this into a few different topics. One is the habitat we need on the landscape for bobwhites. So we'll just get a primer on what habitat is great for bobwhites. Then we'll talk about kind of the bigger issue is what do we have? And this is a big part of why bobwhites have disappeared. And then try and address where can we find space on the landscape? We have a few populations that are hanging on the eastern shore, maybe some in southern Maryland, maybe some in Montgomery County, but huge areas of Maryland, these birds have been extirpated. And so where can we find space to bring them back on a landscape scale? Because that's really what we need to have sustainable populations. And I break this down into 3 main land cover areas. One is forests, and we'll talk, I think this is our biggest area of opportunity. Crops and hay, how can we modify our crop practices to improve their ability to support bobwhites? And finally, talk a little bit about turf grass. We have a lot of turf grass in this state. So, and I'll close with some of our work with how we can track our impacts, track habitat work through acoustic monitoring that we've been working on out at Point Pleasant Farm and in partnership with Delaware Department of Natural Resources, DENREC. So we'll dive into the background. So this is that trophic pyramid or an energy pyramid that I like to start a lot of my talks with. And it just is a high level overview of how energy and moves through our ecosystems. And at the base of our pyramid, we have the producers. This is the foundation, this is the plants, and this is where the most of the habitat and biomass comes from the energy from the sun, converts it into forage for all sorts of primary consumers, rabbits, deer, quail. And then you have predators that then prey on these consumers on up this food chain. And as you move up into this food chain, you lose some of the energy. There's about 10 times fewer, a tenth of the biomass on each of these levels as you move up from consumers to secondary consumers to tertiary consumers. So you have relatively few numbers of predators on the landscape as compared to the biomass of consumers on the landscape, as compared to the biomass of all of the plants that are grown in a given area. So this is that land cover and habitat piece that we talk a lot about for bobwhites. It's, I think, a big focus, and rightly so. And there's also a talk I want to give in the future on predators. They're certainly an issue for bobwhite management, and I think there's a lot of interesting aspects to predators that I hear some aspects where some people might think a particular species is of particular concern, but maybe it's another species. So that's for a future talk that I really want to put together, the differences between Cooper's hawks and red-tailed hawks, black snakes, raccoons, possums, coyotes, foxes. How do all these predators fit in And that's a topic for another day because I would go on for an hour and a half if I went on both of these topics. But for now, we'll start with this land cover and habitat piece. So why do we care about bobwhites? This is the breeding bird survey data from the Maryland Breeding Bird Survey. And these bars represent the proportion of bird species in each of these guilds: the grassland guild, the successional shrub guild, wetlands or woodlands on the bottom. This is the percentage of birds that are classified in that kind of category of habitat that have either increased, which is in green, stayed about the same, no significant differences, which is in gray, or had a significant decline over the last 40, 50 years, and that's in red. So as you glance at this, at these different categories, you can see our grassland birds. By far, the majority of them have been significantly declining over time. Successional and scrub birds have also, where bobwhite quail sit in, have also declined. The majority of them have declined. Wetlands, we've had a probably pretty even mix. Some have increased, some have decreased. And woodlands, on general, we've had more increases and a lot staying the same than we've had declines. So I'd just like to share a broad overview of what our bird data looks like over time. If we look at individual species, and this is the top 20 declining bird species during that same time period from the Maryland Breeding Bird Survey. And you can see northern bobwhite tops the list as the #1 declining bird in Maryland. Many people don't know that. Doesn't get a lot of press. We're trying to get the word out. But if you look, this chart of the top 20 declining ones is ranked, is colored by whether they are an early successional or a shrub preferring bird species. And so if they're in green, they like that early successional vegetation communities. And so you see 9 of the top 10 prefer this grassland or early successional habitat. So this is kind of a wake-up call that I'm trying to get the word out that we need to work on our grasslands and our shrublands. As I mentioned, bobwhites are extirpated from much of Maryland. I actually just had a conversation with somebody this morning. Very promising sighting in southern Maryland. I've been chasing bobwhites in southern Maryland for years and I know there's a population near Greenberry Point, but beyond that, it seems as though they were extirpated, although I just got word that somebody saw a covey with young in southern Maryland. So that's really exciting. So we might have to add a little circle to southern Maryland at some point. But we have huge areas, and these circles are very probably not exactly accurate. Some of these populations are quite limited, but we have some populations hanging on, and some of these are maybes because sometimes there's released birds that tend to not survive very long in the wild. They do not survive long in the wild based on all the research I've read. And so sometimes people will release birds and they're not really self-sustaining populations. So there's some complications, especially I'm not sure on Montgomery County how things are going on that, but pretty exciting to see that. So this is the process of succession that we like to think about on the landscape. And this is where a lot of people think, well, how did we ever have grasslands and shrublands in the landscape? And one of the key disturbances that would have created habitat for bobwhites is fire. We would have had fire that rolled through, would not have been stopped. There was a lot of indigenous burning going on to create habitat and to push animals out of woods so they could hunt them better. So there was a lot of fire on the landscape historically, which would have helped reset this process of vegetation and created new openings, new shrublands on the landscape. And just to highlight where bobwhite quail fit on this, they fit anywhere from right after a big fire all the way up until a forest is 4, maybe 6, even 8 years of a regenerating forest can provide a lot of good cover for bobwhites. As it gets older than 6 to 8 years, you start to have it really start not having the characteristics that bobwhites prefer. There's a lot of different types of structures that we can think about this. Now, we have that one model on the top that I showed you just a second ago, but fire could come back every 3 or 4 years, or it could come every 2 years. And the frequency in which fire is occurring on the landscape will significantly change what that landscape is going to look like in the future. And I like to share this slide because it also shows a lot of different ways in which we can think about a forest. A lot of times we think of a forest as a closed canopy, mature woodland that we see around a lot of Maryland, but there's a lot of different examples of what that could look like. And these different, more spaced types of forests can provide a lot more habitat, even in a wooded setting. There's another angle on that same picture where you have if you want a lot of different diversity of birds, we want a lot of diversity of habitats on the landscape. And in Maryland, what's happened in a lot of our cases is we have a relatively even age stand of forest. Many of our forested areas were cut 80 to 120 years ago, and they've all regenerated at approximately the same time. And so we have a lot of forests that are between 60 to 100 years old. That's the majority of the age classes of our forests in Maryland. They haven't had oftentimes not a lot of thinning, not a lot of aspects to create disturbance or create openings in these forests. So we'll go through why that is an issue. And so here's a picture of the historical fire frequency here in the United States. This was estimated using tree ring data, where researchers bore holes into the trunk of a large old tree and they can count the rings and they can see fire scars of charcoal on the rings of that tree. And they can count how frequently, on average, across looking at hundreds and hundreds of samples of tree rings, how frequently fire would have gone through the landscape. And here in Maryland, we see this orange, this medium orange to light orange color, which leads to a lot of our areas in Maryland would have had fire coming through on an average of every 4 to 12 years, we would have had fire moving through, more frequently on the eastern shore, a little less frequently as you move into the more mountainous areas. So that's kind of a big background. Now let's dive into land cover and habitat and what quail need to survive. Now this is a really good sort of Bobwhite habitat 101. So what does it look like? A lot of times we think of these as grasslands, but we really should be thinking of them as forb lands. And forbs are broadleaf plants, wildflowers, usually anything that's not a grass or a rush or a sedge. So this picture on the right shows that you have this grass, this bunch grass in the middle. It's a native broom sedge, and you have all these different forbs that are growing up around it. Lanceleaf coreopsis, late bone set, mare's tail. All these other things are more dominant than the grasses, and that's the kind of structure we're looking for. And another important thing is the importance of bare ground. You can see around that bunch grass in the middle, that native bunch grass right there, there's dirt around it. There's space in which animals, especially chicks, baby bobwhite chicks, can be moving around and foraging in this kind of a landscape. As I mentioned, we a long time, 20, 30 years ago, a lot of our bobwhite habitat work was focused on planting warm season grasses. I always like to emphasize that we're really looking for less grass and more of these wildflowers. So if you see a grassland that looks a little bit more like on the left, these are native grasses, but they're not providing a lot of seeds, not as many insects. Certainly grasshoppers will persist in there, but not as much diversity on the left compared to what I would just call as a wildflower field or a forbland on the right, where you have all these different insects coming into flowers, different colors of flowers, different types and sizes of seeds that are being dropped at the end of the season for these birds. Insects are so important because the bobwhite chicks, and goes for a lot of different birds, is as those birds' chicks are growing, even if it's primarily a seed-eating bird like quail are when they're adults, when they're chicks, they almost entirely get their nutrition from insects because they are high protein and they allow for fast, rapid growth in those early stages of development. So insects are really key, and that's why we like to have all these different diversity of flowers bringing in bugs and pollinators. Here's some examples of some different habitat here in Maryland. This is at the Nanticoke Wildlife Management Area where there are wild quail. And I like to show this because it's this diverse grassland. You see the different patches on the landscape. You see eastern red cedar out in the distance. I have found those shrubby patches of spaced out eastern red cedar seems to be a spot that quail like to focus in on. So I like to show that example. Here's some habitat edge areas. Again, you see this diverse mix of goldenrods. There's some grasses in there. There's a lot of different forbs. There's some bare areas, and there's almost like an umbrella canopy over the top, and there's space in the bottom for birds to move around. This is at a workshop we did with John Long and Tom Fisher down on the East Lower Shore, and they had felled some trees into a hedgerow to create sort of instant shrubby cover on the landscape. And this is important for bobwhites to escape predation from hawks, especially. And I took this picture. This is actually just outside of where I work at the Y Research Station. And it was not this year, the last year, we had a snow. And I took this picture because there is a patch of blackberry. This is a blackberry thicket right here in the middle of this picture. It doesn't show up super clear in winter, but that's what that is. And I took this picture because on the mowed area in front, that's turf grass, all this snow is still sitting on the surface. But where that blackberry thicket was, all the snow had either been held up enough or there was also enough warmth in that environment that it melted the snow faster than what was on that open grassland. So that the importance of these shrubby areas are also really key for snow events and reducing some of the impacts of cold winter events. Now, this snowfall we had just a couple months ago And that ice storm really did a number. And I found a lot of that ice was even forming underneath these thickets. So it was a pretty extreme event. Uh, Certainly a challenging time for bobwhites. So hopefully they made it through this winter acceptably well. I know some folks I've been talking to are talking about 50% mortality, but hopefully there's enough left that they can quickly repopulate. And bobwhites are known as a boom bust species. They're known to make up for their high mortalities every year with high reproduction. So they have lots of chicks every year. So that's sort of what they need, and what they also, so those are the sort of habitats. Now, how do you keep those habitats? Because out here in Maryland, what will happen is you end up with a lot of these growing up into forests very quickly. So how do we keep open grasslands? How do we keep shrublands and keep them from turning into a forest? There's four main disturbances I like to go through. This is prescribed burning. There's a lot of work right now going on to expand our capacity to do prescribed burning. We're holding one actually at Point Pleasant Farm on Thursday. We're going to be trying to burn a lot of acres there. And this burning helps to set back some of the trees. It will kill some trees, it will weaken many others, and it will maintain more of a grassland or shrubby setting. The nice thing about fire as well is that it tends to not always burn perfectly uniform. You will have certain patches that burn well and some that don't. And as you consistently place fire on the landscape over time, you will have patchiness on the landscape where some places will burn multiple times over the course of several years, whereas some places might not burn at all. If there's a wet spot in the soil, it might not carry fire. So this ends up creating a lot of diversity and vegetation structure that changes across the landscape just from the random variation of how fires are burning on the landscape. Disking is another tool to help disturb the land and set back successional vegetation, set back vegetation, knock back trees, keep things open. A lot of folks really don't like to disturb soil, but disking is one of those tools in the toolbox where you can also create fire breaks and also help to set back that vegetation through disking. And finally, this is a drone actually spraying herbicide. Herbicide is one of the tools that is in the toolbox, with sometimes the challenges today of getting burning done, impacts of smoke. We sometimes have limitations on when we can get burning done. Herbicide is another form of disturbance that can help set back the vegetation structure in a way that can benefit bobwhites. And finally, the last type of disturbance is grazing. There's not a whole lot of folks using grazing as a form of disturbance, but I think it's a tool in the toolbox. Certainly in places like Texas, it is oftentimes used as a way to maintain certain types of vegetation communities. I think we have opportunities to do more research on this. I'd like to move towards that in the coming years and see how we can, whether it's goats or cattle, how we can try to have that as another form of disturbance to increase heterogeneity on the landscape. Now, the type of grazing we're going to do for bobwhites is going to be very diverse. It's not going to be our fine, improved fescue pastures with exotic grasses that are kept relatively short. It's going to be a weedy field. Cattle probably aren't going to gain as well or as consistently as if they're on a standard fescue field. But I think there's opportunities where we can maintain agriculture, have livestock on the landscape, have some income generating activities while also maintaining wildlife habitat. So I think there's opportunities there. There's work to be done though. So those four main disturbances: burning, disking, herbicide, and grazing. Now, you notice I didn't say mowing. Mowing does work. It can help set back the vegetation. The one thing that is a bit challenging with it is that it can oftentimes it will increase grass cover. And remember, we're trying to aim for more forbs. So what's one result of mowing? The other is mowing during the summer leads to a lot of mortalities on wildlife, especially if you mow during the nesting season for bobwhites. So a lot of times they'll be nesting in our open fields from June through July 15th. Some will nest even later on into August. So preventing mowing during that critical time period is really important. And also making sure there's enough cover in the grasslands during that time so that it can support nests. The other aspect of mowing, even right around August 15th, which is when a lot of folks' programs will allow them to start mowing, is it's nice to leave winter cover all the way through. And a lot of folks might say, oh, that's this messy, grassy area that hasn't been mowed. I want to clean that up. But leaving that messy field is leaving a lot of thermal cover. It's leaving cover for mice, for voles, for all sorts of different creatures, rabbits, and bobwhites. So they have a place to hide in the winter. And when you see these events like this snowstorm, having the more cover you have on the landscape will hold as much as you can of that snow off the ground, leave spaces for animals to be underneath, And it also provides warmth because it's covered from the wind. So if you mow it really short at the end of the summer and you have it short all year long, it is just an open, the wildlife don't have a blanket when it comes to these cold winters in December and January. So leaving cover all the way through. And if you're going to mow, the time to do it is between March around right now until about April 15th. It's before anything starts nesting, but it's also things are starting to warm up. And so things are not going to be as needing of that cover during this time. And you can kind of space your mowing around so as to not disturb everything all at once. Okay. So that's like what bobwhites need, what the habitat we need in the landscape. Now, what do we have? And this is, I think, getting into the real issue of what's happened on our landscape. And we'll dive into how we can start thinking about changing our landscapes to fit and how this could work for, say, you're a landowner or you're a land manager or you know somebody or you're an individual who wants to give feedback to how to manage the landscape. Some of these ideas will help inform what we could do in the future. So where can we find space? There was just a great podcast that Stephen Ranella did on the Meat Eater podcast. He had a conversation with Carl Malcolm with the Rough Grouse Society and American Woodcock Society. And they had a really interesting conversation where they were talking about the issue of development versus forest management. And they talk a lot. Carl did a great job articulating how forests have really not been maintained. They've been all allowed to grow up at the same age, and that's a problem. And Steve is asking him, well, Steve says, I've also seen these areas, these forests I used to hunt became a housing development. How do these pan out? How much is this is just leaving our forests alone and not doing action on them versus like some relatively irreversible development that's just taking away habitat? And they hadn't really, Carl says, I'm not really sure which one it is, but I tell you, I've looked at the statistics. I've looked at our GIS numbers, and I'm going to share them with you right now. And I have a very clear thinking on this. And it's not so much development, although development is an issue. It's more an issue of habitat and managing the rural areas we have. And here's why. So this is the percentage of land cover in Maryland. This is based on the Chesapeake Conservancy's land use, land cover mapping effort. This is 1 meter resolution with high resolution satellite imagery, and they classified at a very fine scale all the different types of land cover in Maryland. So forest is our number one land cover here in the state. It's 46.8% of the state is forested. Second largest is cropland at 18%. Developed is 11.7%. Developed is a pretty big chunk of our landscape, but as compared to forest and cropland, it's relatively small. The fourth largest is turf grass. I would probably put this in with the developed category. However, I think we have a lot of opportunities to fix turf grass to make them a lot more conducive to bobwhite and other wildlife. After that, we have pastures and hay. And then in red here, this little chunk here that's 3.9% is what's classified as natural succession. Now, this is probably the type of habitat that bobwhites might be able to use. So if you're looking at the landscape and thinking, where are the bobwhites going to live? We have just a tiny sliver on the landscape where that's pretty decent type of habitat for them. So this helps to explain to me, this is a big issue. Just look at this pie. We have about 4% in succession. Pasture and hay oftentimes isn't particularly conducive. It could be if managed differently. But again, we have these giant land covers of forest and cropland that are there waiting for us to be managed differently. So in my opinion, development is an impact, but it's 12% of our landscape. Meanwhile, we have, if we just look at on the top right, I pulled out our forest land, our cropland, our turf grass, and our pasture and hay. And just those four categories are 77% of our landscape. So I'm going to focus our talk on those four and how we can adjust those four. I'm going to assume developed is probably kind of, it's pretty developed. We're going to cut that out and not worry about that. We still have a huge area of our landscape left to work with for bobwhite habitat. So, and this is just some satellite imagery showing you exactly what I see. I live right near Huntingtown NRMA over in Calvert County, and it's about this whole area. We have farmed fields. These are all farmed. All these openings are all farmed, and we have mature forest. This forest is about 8,100 years old. Very similar stands all throughout, and we have wetland areas. Very little early successional habitat in here. This is the Patuxent Research Refuge. I think there's a road in this refuge named Quail Lane. Let me tell you, there's no quail there anymore. This place was known for having great research on quail. They have some published research papers from the 60s looking at quail diets from this location, and quail have not been here for a while. And you can just look at the landscape at a glance and see why. This is probably 85 to 90% forested. There are a few areas. There's some wetland complexes. There's a few meadow areas on the landscape. I do give them that. I like to see that. However, as a general concept, this is a very forest dominated area, and honestly, this is a power line running right through the middle of it, and the power line probably provides as much early successional vegetation and habitat as all the other areas as well. So for me, it's always a little strange when power lines tend to be some of the best habitat on the landscape. So I think there's some opportunities to diversify and make this have a lot of different structures in the landscape. And as we do that, we're going to support a lot more different wildlife species. This one is always kind of it hits me hard. I was searching for bobwhites, and this is in Prince George's County, I believe, at a public land. And we were putting out acoustic recorders trying to find out if there's any bobwhites left. And somebody mentioned this: if they're going to be there, this might be a spot to check. And I go there, and the grassy fields were here completely planted in with trees. Now, I love trees, but we have a lot of trees in Maryland. And it's always rough when I see this is probably the biggest open field within 3 to 5 miles. And to see it being planted in with trees is kind of rough. It kind of hurts. It's a quail manager's worst nightmare, because for a few years, this is not terrible quail habitat. There's some management changes that could be done. But this is soon going to age out and will not be long-term quail habitat with all these trees coming in. So it's also generally, as tree plantings are going in, they're mowing in between the rows, and the mowing is not allowing for any nesting occurring during that summer. So if there were quail, their nests are probably going to get mowed down during the protecting these trees that are going in. So we are working quite hard to try and think about it's a well-meaning, well-intentioned effort to get more trees. I think, my kids talk about this like, oh, plant more trees. Well, increasingly, I'm starting to feel like one of the best things we can do for the environment, and this is going to be a little controversial, is to cut more trees and to manage our forests for more diversity on the landscape. So one thing that we're working on to try and work within this policy is to promote not just large statured trees like oaks and sycamores and other species, but also small trees and shrubs and early successional habitats. So I'm working with Daniel Pratson, Kyle Magic, and Ben Larson. We've got a paper coming out here in the next few weeks talking about how these small trees, you can get hazelnuts, dogwoods. There's a whole lot of trees that will provide shrubby types of components on the landscape. They'll still count as trees. So we can still get to the 5 million trees. We can have just more diversity of these lower and smaller statured trees on the landscape to help provide habitat for our most declining species on the landscape. Okay, so went into a little bit of some of the stuff on forests, but so we're going to go through forests, crops and hay, what we can do on our agriculture, and then turf grass. So we'll start with where we can do on forests and some management aspects, just to provide some insights. Now, I went through this with my daughter because she's like, Dad, you can't be cutting trees. I'm like, honey, this is what our forests look like. This is a forest over at Point Pleasant Farm. And if you look through here, there's hardly any shrubs growing in the understory. There's no food in the pantry if you are a terrestrial animal in this environment. There's also no cover to hide from predators if you're walking through this environment. This is where quail would go to die. This is a quail graveyard. They're completely exposed, and there's not much food on the ground for them. So I like to think about showing these pictures to my daughter. I was like, hey, look at this. This is from the National Deer Association. They did timber stand improvement on this forest, and they created a lot of openings. And then look at the understory response where you have all this cover. This isn't necessarily ideal bobwhite habitat, but it's a little bit overgrown for them. But they're not going to die if they move into these edges. They're not sitting ducks as they were in the previous example. Here is a well-managed forest that the Nature Conservancy manages at Nasawongo Creek down on the lower shore. And they manage this with thinning and with fire. And you can see there's this nice interspacing of trees and shrubs in the landscape. There is bare ground in between. A lot of people have never seen a forest like this. You have to go. I think it's one of the few places I can think within a few hours that you can go and see a forest like this. And there's bobwhites there today. This is John Long and Tom Fisher's place. They've gone even more. You can space your trees out to much more of a savanna setting. These are also quality habitat for grassland species, but you can still have trees. And I'm trying to destigmatize that word that sometimes comes off as a bad word called clear cuts. I think clear cuts, or mostly clear cuts, are a tool in which we can reset that successional vegetation. We don't have fire anywhere like what we used to have on the landscape naturally occurring. So it's a tool in which we can restart our processes on the landscape and allow for different ages and structure of our landscape. And this is just shortly after a clear cut occurred. You can see there's already a lot of vegetation coming up, a lot of forbs and natural vegetation. Here's another example. This is actually a Maryland Forest Service cut. There are quail in this area. These red colors up in the front, this all is regenerating so fast. These are devil's walking sticks, which if you've ever been around these in the fall, they are magnets for butterflies. I've never seen butterflies mob a flower as much as devil walking stick in late summer, September, August, September. When those flowers go off, it is crazy to see the butterflies come in. So a lot of really good stuff comes in after these cuts. So we're not just removing and destroying the environment, it's creating different aspects on the landscape for wildlife. Okay, so one thing I hear a lot of is forest interior dwelling species birds. In June 2000, the state put out this guide for conservation of forest interior dwelling birds in the critical area. And this is, if you work in natural resources, you've probably heard of something called FIDS. This is FIDS. And this guidance talks a lot about how we should manage our forests. And in it, they have examples of how you should do development and how you should maintain your forests. On the left here, on the top left, you see you shouldn't be putting a development into the forest. You should be putting it on the outside. You want to reduce the amount of edge on your forest. Here on the left, you see you don't want to have trees in between your homes. You want to have all the homes on the outside edge of the forest and as much compacted and away from this sort of large contiguous forest. And the idea is that all these birds here listed in the report were classified as forest interior dwelling species birds. The idea is that they're going to be not as successful in nesting and surviving in the environments on the left where the guidelines were not followed because there's more edge and there's fewer of this contiguous forest compared to the right where there's a large contiguous area. So I was looking at this and thinking, man, I'm just not sure. I want to look into this. And so I have a student that's working through a literature review on all these species, and I've seen a number of research papers on this. And so we went through and have literature, and we've got citations, and we're working on putting a publication together for this. And we went through and categorized these 20, I think it was about 25 species here on the right of forest interior dwelling species birds. Went through and classified them based on some of the more recent research since 2000 and even before on what are the types of habitats they need. And so it turns out, as we look at this, some of these species are pretty adaptable. They're generalists. They do need some forests, but they're adaptable. Some of them are early successional or need young forests, like whippoorwills, which have disappeared from large areas of our landscape. They disappeared around the same time quail did. Early successional or young forests like red-eyed vireas, scarlet tanagers, worm-eating warblers for their post-fledging time. So when they have their nests, they will move to these young forests to feed their young with insects. We have 5 that's, I think, pretty classically fit in the FIDS definition. 4 others needed mature forests, but with gaps and with canopy openings. Some others needed mature forest, but they needed an understory. Several were old growth specialists, and several were riparian obligates. They're really pulling into the riparian areas more than a broad and open forest. So of this, it's a whole list. 15 of the 25 either need an understory, they need early successional vegetation for part of their life stages, they need young forests, or they need some canopy gaps. So the majority of the species in that list really call for some of the diversity that we're talking about. So something we're working on trying to get the word out and update with the latest research on some of the things we can do to help even support these forest interior dwelling species birds to help improve their survival rates. So another thing I hear from a lot of folks, actually Ken Staver, if he's here listening, talks a lot about historically this was all a forest. And so we have an interesting conversation about this. And I think one thing is we really have very little data. We have some journal accounts. We do have data on how much timber was harvested from the East Coast and how much was moved out and sold in markets and moved out of ports. So huge amounts of timber was certainly taken. But we don't have a good idea of what these species were, what the landscape really looked like besides some accounts on journals. John Smith wrote about how he could drive a wagon through the forest, horse-drawn wagon through a forested area. So there were spaced out trees in some of his journal accounts. So perhaps that was some aspect where you had openings in the forest or widely spaced trees. Might have been a lot different than some of our forests today. But this, I like to draw attention to this article here that was sort of opposed to some of the early successional efforts. And the thinking was that really bobwhite quail in the 50s and 60s, that was just an artifact of wide scale clearing. Same thing with bobolinks and meadowlarks. They're all in decline because they were artificially inflated because of timber harvests that were done 100 years ago. So I looked at this and I looked up this article and I saw this chart and if you can, what this explains is that over time from 1600 to today, you had this very high in forest and then it dropped down around 1900s. And then as the forests have recovered, that has led to meadowlarks and bobolinks dropping back down. So this is so really those species aren't historically abundant. So we shouldn't really worry about having them on the landscape. Well, I was like, well, this is interesting. And I want to look this stuff. And so I looked up this at the bottom of the caption. It says adapted from Foster et al. 2002. So I went and looked up that paper. And in it, they share actually a couple of models. This one on the top is one of the models that was shown that was used in the paper in the prior link. But they also show another model from DeGraaf and Yamansky and also modified from Bickford and Diamond. So there was two models of what the landscape used to look like in the past, and there's an active debate about what was in the landscape. So I thought that was interesting to see that there are some people who say, well, maybe there was some forests, or maybe we had a middle grade of forest, and we definitely harvested a lot, but then it's coming back in different ways. Just like to share this to show that it's not necessarily. I think there's active debate about what used to be here, and we have to have a little bit of humility and understanding about of what we really know prior to 1600. And also think about what kind of diversity do we want on our landscape to support. So just wanted to put that in there for folks who are kind of concerned about the forest birds. I think there's opportunities to maintain them and maintain some of our early successional species as well. Okay, so that's all the forest stuff, and I'll get off my soapbox on that one. Let's talk about crops and hay and what you can do with crops and hay to make them better for bobwhites and other early successional species. So some of our farm fields in this area look a little bit like this, where you have trees overhanging the edge of the farm field. This is an opportunity for a win-win for the farmer and for early successional species like bobwhites. This is a farmer who did a practice called edge feathering, where he basically pushed back the edge of that forest 50 to 100 feet back. And now if you look at what's growing, we have all these wildflowers and shrubs and grasses growing in this band where he pushed the trees back. So he's diversifying the structure of the landscape on the forest around his farm field. He didn't have to take anything out of agricultural production. And arguably, he's going to have a lot of benefits to his agriculture because the less shading and less competition from the roots of these trees. And believe it or not, trees in this picture right here, these trees are putting out roots underneath this farm field. And in drought conditions, these soybeans here on the left will be wilting, while the ones in full sun in the middle will not be, because the trees are actually sucking water from underneath these soybeans on the edge. So there's a double competition for light and shading, and also for moisture and nutrients underneath. So this is a pretty easy win-win for a farmer, and also for creating some diversity of habitat on the landscape in an agricultural setting. Hay fields. They're, I think, a pretty good chunk of our landscape is in hay. We produce quite a bit of hay in Maryland. And haying, unfortunately, can be kind of rough on birds, especially ground nesting birds that are laying nests, laying eggs, and putting in nests in these fields right before they get cut. And it's a rough thing. And I support agriculture. I've got farming friends, but this is one of those ones that's just a really hard on wildlife. If one of your goals is to improve nest survival of turkeys or nest survival of bobwhites or any birds that are nesting in these areas, haying can be one of the most challenging aspects to their survival, because they're attracted to nest in there. And then at the first cut, which is usually coincides almost perfectly with the nesting season, if the nests don't get cut from the mowers, predators come in, and they're all very easily exposed, and predators can come in and pick up easy meals. And that's why you see vultures and crows following behind hay fields when they're first cut. So I worked with Jenny Freeberry, and shout out to Jenny if you're here on the call. She did a great job in pulling this together, and we worked together in getting this out. It's going to be getting published here soon. And we put together just a list of, I think we have, 8 or 10 different practices you can do to help reduce the impact of haying on wildlife. Some of them are economically not as beneficial. Some of them aren't a huge cost. So there's a lot of different things you can do and selecting which fields you hay, which ones you leave behind, delaying cuts in certain fields that you might be beneficial for wildlife. And this isn't just bobwhites. This is turtles. This is meadowlarks. This is bobolinks. There's a suite of species that all get caught up in hayfields. So just a tool in the toolbox for people to choose, pick and choose some aspects of this, so where they can try and minimize the damage caused from regular hay operations. And it's rough, but this helps to make it a little bit easier. And there's a draft publication. If you go to that QR code and take a picture with your phone, you can pull up that draft and give me some feedback. Dan Small has done some great work over on the Eastern Shore. Amazing work over the last more than a decade on bobwhite habitat, and they put this in on a center pivot area on property that they work on, and you can see they've just added these prairie strips into the middle of the field. Now, a farmer might say, like, God, that's taking land out of production, but I also know most farmers will say, oh, I'd rather be in production and have some of these things in the way than to be kind of taken entirely out of production. So I think it's always important to try and find ways in where we can work together with economic motivations to help make these things work together. Because I think we can. I think we definitely can make it all work. And they put these in to help create connectivity. It's maybe not ideal for bobwhites, but it provides connectivity. It provides some areas of habitat where they can move through the landscape. So I put in here, since we're on the farming, I put in here sorghum. Our farmer out at Point Pleasant Farm is going to plant sorghum this year. And I was so excited because after sorghum is harvested, it leaves a lot of thatch on the ground and a lot of cover. So it's going to be great for the wildlife from that perspective in terms of cover over winter. Also, sorghum seeds as they fall are great bird food. So for bobwhites, I'm really excited to have sorghum getting planted for that double aspect of any waste grain that falls and doesn't get harvested, and that's great bird food. You can buy some of that back from your farmer as well if you need to do any supplemental feeding. That's another topic, but it also provides a lot of thatch over the winter for birds to be moving around in that field. And finally, I've learned a lot from some friends, including Fabio, who's on this call right now, is the importance of the different types of insecticides and pesticides that are being used. And we had a webinar last October with Kelly Hamby, who talks about the importance of how you can actually use some of these herbicides or even not use them and insecticides and still have great crop yields. Up to 3 or 4, maybe even 5 years, you can benefit before those pests start to cycle back up. So there's a lot of different insecticides. That webinar, I will put maybe Evan, if you can find a link to that YouTube channel and pop it in the chat for everybody. It was a really interesting conversation to hear about the different types of insecticides. And so we want to so quail and all these other birds need insects when they're growing their chicks. So as much as you can work with your farmer to avoid what's probably the biggest challenge is the broad spectrum insecticides like the pyrethroids or permethrin. So these broad spectrum insecticides can really kill all the insects, including some of your beneficial insects. So those are some of the things to work on, trying to reduce. I will add in a lot of our seeds today come coated with neonicotinoids. These are also going to kill any insects that eat on that corn plant for the first several weeks or months of its life. So again, some of these you can get away without putting them in and without using them for a few years and still have fine crop yields that will catch up with you after several years. But there's just a lot of different aspects you can think about in terms of pesticide reduction and insecticide reduction to improve insects on your landscape. Okay. The final thing I think I have here is fallowing fields. So you can just let fields go fallow, and this is what they look like. We have a lot of we didn't plant a thing in here. We have a lot of native forbs coming in, some exotic grasses and other grasses, but it's providing a lot of good structure on the landscape. All right, I'm going to wrap this up in here just a couple of more minutes here, and hopefully we'll get to have some time for questions. So turf grass, again, I think it's over about 7 or 8% of our landscape. A lot of folks are just mowing huge, expansive lawns, and it takes a lot of time and effort to do this. And this could very easily be just reduced in terms of the amount of mowing that's going on. You can just reduce the mowing to once a year, let it grow up into a habitat, maybe do some control of the exotics and non-natives. But we have turf grass everywhere. These are field buffers that are put into fescue. This is not good habitat, even though it's grass. It's exotic grasses. It creates a sod and not great for cover for wildlife. There's mowed areas and or out in rural areas as well. All over the place, you see these turf grass landscapes that could all just is not providing those seeds or abundance flowers for diversity that are needed for bobwhite. So all these areas you might see grasses, but they're not good habitat. But one way in which you can adjust your habit, your practice, is you could just stop, like I mentioned, stop mowing part of the lawn, and it will grow up into this structure in the background. Now, this is pretty thick. This is probably thicker than ideal for quail, but it's something a lot better than a turf grass mowed field. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up and talk a little bit about acoustic monitoring that we've been doing. We've put out audio moth recorders over the last 4 or 5 years. We've been developing this, and we've been marking the bird calls. This is a bobwhite call on the spectrogram here, and we've classified all these and put them into a deep learning algorithm. And we've done a lot of work on this over the last several years, and we deployed 10 of these across Point Pleasant Farm where I'm working. And we fallowed a lot of the farmland on the property. And this has allowed for what I think is probably a lot more bird diversity on the landscape. And I want to share some of our early results. So this graph shows each of the different colors on this map are all different bird species, and the height of those bars is the number of calls that we have. And so as you just look from 2024 on the left, when we started this, we had a bad batch of batteries. That's why there's a gap right there. But in the early stages of 2024, we had about 1,000 calls a day for birds. As we moved into our second year of fallowing, we were getting well over 1,000 and up to almost 1,500. And so you can just look at a glance and see there's a whole lot more bird calls coming in after we fallowed fields for just 2 years. So really excited about just at a glance seeing the impacts of habitat work. And we can dive into particular species. We don't have bobwhites there yet. That's on the goal, but we can see some of the impacts of kestrels that have come back. We've had these great increases of our kestrel populations. Our eastern meadowlarks, I think they're one of the top 5 declining birds. We've had them have very strong recoveries on the property. Even scarlet tanagers, which are one of those forest birds, they've done well, having increased early successional vegetation on the landscape. So with that, I will just wrap this up, say the habitat we need is that early successional vegetation. What do we have? We have a lot of mature forests. We have crops, development, turf grass, and hay pasture, and just a tiny sliver of 3 or 4% of our landscape in early succession. So where do we find that space? I think forests are probably our biggest opportunity. 45% of our landscape is forests. A huge opportunity to do timber management, make money in some cases from doing timber work, and diversify and create benefits for wildlife. Crops and hay, I think there's some opportunities to adjust our practices, and turf grass, just reduce our mowing and trying to convert some of these to more native grasslands. Want to shared a little bit about tracking those impacts for acoustic monitoring. I'm really excited about where we are going on this, and we have some great advancements going on for that. Happy to share more, and I'll stop. If you would like, there's a free copy of this bobwhite quail habitat guide here available on this website when you join our email list at wildlife.umd.edu. Send me an email as well, and I can send you a copy of it. So, Bobwhite's question: interest in recent quail sightings in southern Maryland? Yes, Todd. I am very excited. I don't want to step out of line and say exactly where it was, but yes, it was pretty exciting, and I'll be talking to him in the next few days about getting some practice on the ground to improve what's going on down there and try and keep them going. What is the range of bobwhites when a covey gets established? What is the radius they travel, or what do you call their home range? Great question, Chris. I would say a covey home range can be as small as 20 to 40 on up to 80 acres. So not a huge home range. Now that's a general where they will generally live and have their covey core area. But what will happen is you will have dispersal of young, and the largest known dispersal that I'm aware of from a radio tracked quail was 6 miles. And I think that was out of Texas, out of the Dale Rollins's Rolling Plains Research Coalition. They found one of the birds went 6 miles. So that's kind of the maximum range of which you could expect this sort of dispersal distance for bobwhites. In reality, I would say 2 to 3 miles is probably 90% of where the outside range of where you'd find bobwhites dispersing to. So there are some opportunities if you're within a few miles of known bobwhite populations. And that's the ideal thing, is to work with where populations exist and try and get them to expand. Do pheasant occupy the same niche as quail? Are they likely to return if the quail habitat improved? I don't do a whole lot of work on pheasants. I have hunted them many times. My understanding, and the reason part of the reason why is they're not a native species to North America. They're from China, which is fine. But they're a cool bird to hunt. But in terms of how they persisted on the landscape in the past, I suspect similar to how quail. I'm going to I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not a pheasant expert. But when we try to release pen raised quail on the landscape, a lot of different things have been tried. And when they put collars on these birds, many will die in the first couple of weeks. A few will survive a couple of months. Maybe one will survive for a year. And this has happened time and time again in many different studies, despite all different efforts to try and reduce the mortality through like soft releases and things like that. I suspect in the past, pheasants were able to survive, and maybe some of these released birds could survive because we just had such heavy predator control in the landscape. We didn't have many hawks on the landscape. We had very strong trapping programs. Raccoon pelts were worth something back then. And so I suspect that perhaps pheasants were able to survive in the past was just because of far lower predator abundances on the landscape. So I don't know. I haven't done a lot of work on trying to restore wild pheasant populations, but I kind of wonder whether it's going to be a challenging issue given that they're usually pen raised birds that are released. Certainly some survive in the wild, so but they're not really a focal area of mine. So that's as best I can answer that one, Ed. But I'll look it up a little bit more and see what I can find. Burning related questions. Thanks. And Evan, feel free to chime in if people are asking other questions. I just glanced over. I see Fabio saying use cover crops. Yes, cover crops should have been on one of those slides for agricultural usage. A good mix. Maryland has a great cover crop program. You can put in a couple legumes up to 50% and 50% cereal grain. So that helps to get some cover on the landscape as well. Very good point, Fabio. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, burning. After burning, how do you manage invasives? I think it depends on the invasive and depends kind of the life cycle of it. A lot of times you might have exotic grasses come in, for example. I have found in some of our research plots, after 1 year, we had a whole flush of exotic grass, foxtail, come in. The second year, it sort of petered out and native forbs became dominant. So foxtail, it might not be one of the ones that you're thinking about for invasive, so it really depends on the species. But specifically, I see Barry is asking, how do you manage Lespedeza and thistle after burning? With a lot of these invasives, as much as I don't like to use herbicides or promote herbicides, who likes the idea of having poison on the landscape? But the more and more you work in this area, you just realize it's a tool in the toolbox, and I think it's one of the most effective tools to manage these species. So for Lespedeza, we tried metsulfuron methyl last fall. It was slow to kill the Lespedeza. I think we're going to use something called Pasture Guard, which is a combination of 2 active ingredient herbicides this spring on Lespedeza, spot spraying. If you have a whole field full of it, you might need to do a complete broadcast and sort of reset the whole field. You might benefit by going into agriculture for a year or two to try and reset and get that out of your seed bank. Thistle, there's a couple of herbicides that will work. Roundup will work. It takes sometimes a couple of sprays. There's a thistle-focused herbicide called clopyralid, I believe is the name. Stinger is the brand name that people can use for thistle as well. Always read the label with any herbicide you're going to use. The label is the law, so you're actually required by law to follow the label. So there's a lot of details in those labels on how to use them safely and effectively. Make sure they don't get in your waterways and kill all the frogs, for example, if you're spraying right before rain. Those are some of the general things that will happen a lot of times. So you want to be really careful and use them according to the label. But I think they're a tool in the toolbox when used appropriately and to minimize any negative impacts of them. So plant questions. I put in 500 native trees as borders and hedgerows along the borders of my farm. They're in year 2 and about 50 feet wide. Any recommendations for what to plant among them for better management than just grasses? Chris, that's a great question. I would say I would watch your grasses and think about ways in which you can manage. I'd want to know how the management underneath the trees is going. If they're being mowed, I would say mowing tends to promote more grasses. So sometimes you'll want to mow to establish those trees and make sure you don't have as much competition. But you can once the trees are established, then you can start reducing the mowing frequency. Some other aspects of this are you can spray grass selective herbicides to only kill grasses, and that will help to promote forbs. You can seed in a variety of forb species as well. You can do both of those in combination. So, in order of cost, I would say just spraying out the stuff you don't want is probably the cheapest, sprayed with an herbicide. And seeing how it comes back. And then if you're not getting a good response from the seed bank, you can then look at seeding things in. So that's a quick answer to that. So I think that's kind of a rough guide for where I'd start. Comments, this may be controversial, but MFR big patches have been helpful to me. MFR big patch and multiflora rose. I was surprised when I heard Dan Small, if he's on this call. I'm going to out you, Dan. When he told me, leave your multiflora rose. If you've got multiflora rose, leave it, because we are limiting on their environment. They are limiting on shrubby cover on the landscape. And I was surprised to hear that because Dan's a great ecologist, and this is a pretty nasty invasive, but it is serving a niche on the landscape that I think works as well. Fabio, sounds like you've had success with that as well. So I'm trying to be a realist with our landscape, and so if it's serving a niche and it's working for rabbits, quails, and oftentimes I think it's a great place for rabbits to hide out too. I try to work with what the landscape is giving us. Now, what I will say, I've been to, I believe it's Patuxent River State Park in Howard County, and I saw multiflora rose had completely taken over the entire river bottom. And it was just so insane to get through it. So it can get out of control. It is relatively easy to kill though. So thanks for sharing that comment, Fabio. So if it gets out of control, you can always just try and manage it. Wood thrush also need canopy gaps. Yes, they do. They nest in old trees and take their fledglings to gaps to feed. Thanks for sharing that, Ben. It's interesting research I read. Rewilding from the UK. They have active debates about where they were historically. How many trees versus savannas and meadow species? Yes, for sure, Chris. Use cover crops, 100%. I need a slide on cover crops for sure. My favorite cover crop mix in the Maryland program, for any of you Maryland folks, is I like a 50%. You can have 50% cereal grain, which I like to use winter wheat. Geese like that if you're trying to get Canada geese in there for hunting. And then I like a split of Austrian winter pea and like crimson clover as the second two. You can throw in different types of clovers. Crimson's great. It produces a ton of biomass early in the spring and also senesces and dies on its own around April if you're going to go back into farming. So it kind of helps to self thin itself out versus some of your more perennial clovers, which can sometimes interfere with planting this. Great. I see what nearby states are doing for bobwhite reintroductions. Lou, the Pennsylvania Game Commission is doing a great reintroduction project for bobwhites down in at Letterkenny Army Depot. I visited that with Kyle Magic a year or two ago. They're, I think, on their third year of reintroductions. So that we're awaiting the final outcome of that. The reintroductions are run for 3 consecutive years, and about 60 wild birds are released every year and tracked. And so they're plugging away on that. Delaware, I think, has some goals and efforts to try to improve some of their reintroduction efforts. So that's another aspect to be thinking about here. And then Maryland, I don't think we have very much of an active program. I want to get some going out at Point Pleasant Farm in the coming years. We're trying to get our timber harvested so we can prepare the landscape for them. Okay. Chris, I've been mowing, but would like to shift to forbs, getting Palmer amaranth. Want to make sure that go away. And you are right. I might need to do some targeted spraying. Yeah. Fabio, I'm waiting for Fabio to chime in on this. Some Palmer amaranth it's native to the United States. It's, I think, native to the southwestern United States. So it can be a pretty nasty invasive. I think it is resistant to several herbicides in agricultural areas. So if you have agriculture coming by, that can be a problem. So yes, I think targeted spraying is probably one of the best ways to do that. And my colleague Kurt Vollmer has a lot of work going on for Palmer amaranth. There are some native amaranths out there as well. So some of those can provide actually pretty solid wildlife seed value. So depending on your goals, farmers might not like it if it's a noxious weed, but it can provide other tools, provide other resources for wildlife. So yeah, Fabio says leave it. So these are some of the trade-offs you have to think about on your landscape and what your primary goals are. If they're wildlife, that's one thing. And if you're willing to accept a few invasives that you're willing to monitor and watch versus trying to make things a little better for your farmer. So Did Luke mention New Jersey? I do not know of any New Jersey reintroductions. There could be some going on. Fabio leaves his thistle as well. I've seen butterflies go to thistle plants like crazy. So I think there are some state regulations on them as a noxious weed. So just be aware of that. But so some of these things provide, I think, for some wildlife species as well. So if you want dove and quail, leaving the Palmer. So the state is saying they may find me. Yes. So some of these species are on a noxious weed list, and they, I think, are regulated. If you have them on your landscape, you are required to make an effort to eradicate them. So you need to work with your farmer folks. So, and Fabio's having a great conversation here. Yes, ragweed is a highly great species to plant. It's cheap, it's native, also considered an agricultural weed. NRCS does not like to promote ragweed, I just found, because it's somewhat resistant to glyphosate and can be a problematic ag weed. So something to be aware of, but it's native, so it's nothing that they can fine you over. So I think partridge pea is another quality one to be planting. And I've got a list of about 15 species I'm happy to share with anybody, our mix that we're putting in. It is ideal. We made it to be ideal for not just quail, but also for deer feed, turkeys, and other things as well. Lou asks, is Quail Forever offering reintroductions in the Mid-Atlantic? Let me tell you, quail reintroductions are expensive. They are probably on the order of $100,000 or more. And the main reason for that is because of the effort of trapping wild quail, finding wild quail, which are in decline across much of their range, trapping them, which can take days, maybe weeks, and then transporting them to the location. So it's very labor intensive. I would just, as a back of the envelope, it's on the order of 100,000 or more. So to do that, Quail Forever has done great with their fundraising, but they're not currently, I don't believe they're currently at the scales of starting to fund a reintroduction effort, but it would be a super cool idea, Lou. And feel free to email me if you have any questions, and look forward to seeing you guys next month. Thanks for joining.